Hello, everybody. It is Wednesday in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My name is Adam Bittner, assistant sports editor for multimedia at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, joined for our weekly Penn State football chat by Joel Haas of the Daily Collegian and the Post-Gazette. It's been an angsty week, I think, around the college football landscape. There's been some recriminations about the rankings, recriminations about Peacock airing Penn State's White Out. Big Noon Saturday is starting to get flack from more fan bases than just Penn State and what they've done with the whiteout. So we're going to actually talk about that stuff at the top. Usually we kind of save that for the back half of the episode, but because Penn State is playing Purdue this week, should be a pretty big win for the Nittany Lions. We're going to focus a little more on big picture than nuts and bolts stuff. Looking forward to that conversation. Joel, how are you?
Doing well. Looking forward to making the trip to West Lafayette. So we'll see how that goes. We've got the rental car booked for the whole beat. So.
Well, you know what? Enjoy that one, man. Because I actually, when I was in college, I was the football editor like you are, and that was the one trip I considered skipping, especially because there were some legal things going on, and I was left as editor in chief of the Collegian because we had some people at a conference. And I thought about not going, but then I went, and I was actually really surprised by how nice it is out there at Purdue. Beautiful campus. You can tell it's been built by engineers. There's the one place that has the peanut cheeseburgers. Very good. I forget the exact name, but there's a picture of Guy Fieri on the wall. He was there. So check that out. It's actually a pretty cool trip. I'm jealous of you getting to go out. Before we get into our conversation for the day, I just want to thank our sponsor for this episode of the podcast, Voodoo Brewing Company and State College. Enjoy world-renowned craft beer, delicious cocktails, and our almost famous lobster rolls at Voodoo Brewing Company State College Pub, located right off College Avenue and Route 322 at 201 Elmwood Street. State College VBC has something exciting going on every day of the week. Join us this fall for Mondays for free play cornhole tournaments or test your knowledge with pub trivia every Tuesday at 6. Wednesdays are game night featuring board games, card games, and adult games. Every Thursday, your boy Dots hosts bingo, and this is not your Nana's bingo. Saturday, we have your Nittany Lions and college football on all day. We finish off on Sundays with our weekly brunch paired with Steelers, Eagles, and Red Zone coverage. Can't wait to see you at the VBC State College Pub. All right, Joel, let's get into this rankings angst that has been going on. Penn State, obviously, at number 4 in the AP, and the second college football playoff rankings released Tuesday night. Pat Forde, I believe he's of Sports Illustrated now, and one of the several of the 8 million podcasters who work at Barstool. There's been a lot of anti-Penn State propaganda saying they're way too high at number 4, haven't really beaten anybody of substance, lost their big game to Ohio State. I wanted to get your thoughts on that because, I look at the actual, situation and say, like, in some years, do I think Penn State should be the number 4 team with what they've done this year? Probably not. But if you look down college football, outside the top 5, you've got undefeated Indiana behind them, then an 8-1 Tennessee, 9-0 BYU, 8-1 Notre Dame with a loss to Northern Illinois, 7-2 Alabama, 8-2 Ole Miss, 7-2 Georgia. That carnage in the SEC, Joel, just I think makes it hard to really say definitively that anyone belongs ahead of Penn State. If Alabama was a one-loss team right now and had beaten, multiple teams, do I think they have the talent that they should be ranked ahead of Penn State? Maybe, but they have 2 losses right now. What would you say to people who are arguing rather stridently that Penn State is overrated in both of these polls?
Yeah, I think it's a really tricky situation to judge. It usually is just because of kind of the conferences being in their own bubbles. And obviously, you begin the season with non-conference play, but typically, teams are only going to play one power conference opponent in non-conference, and you really only have that one, kind of point of reference to look at when you're comparing between these conferences, which can make it really difficult. Obviously, there's a lot of pushback, I think, specifically from SEC fan bases about where Penn State is ranked, sitting at number 4 in the country, and SEC fans are quick to kind of point to who has Penn State beaten, and obviously you look at the Nittany Lions schedule and it's not great, and there are individual games within that schedule that you could look at going into the West Virginia game where that was West Virginia was supposed to be a lot better than they have been this season. That was West Virginia was receiving votes in the AP poll and everything like that. You can look at Illinois being the number 19 team in the country when those two played, and it was a pretty competitive game, at least at the start. You could look at USC, which obviously is a very talented team, and and the record doesn't really bear that out. Washington obviously playing in the national championship last year, so you could make the argument for specific games here and there, but the reality is Penn State hasn't beaten any teams that are currently ranked. And if you're a fan of an SEC school, if you're just looking strictly at the win column, there's probably 5, 6, 7 SEC teams that have ranked wins that are in that 1 or 2 loss category that could potentially make an argument against Penn State. But I think obviously you have to consider the losses. That's the other part of it as well. And Penn State has 1 loss right now. It's a close loss to Ohio State, which is the number 2 team in the country. So obviously that's one of the better losses that you can have at this point. Obviously it's unfortunate that Penn State's schedule has played out the way that it has, where they haven't played a top 15, 20 team that you could kind of use as kind of a measuring stick for where Penn State is at right now. But I think the other bigger thing that I would just say is overall in college football, I don't think there is necessarily a dominant elite team. You could argue Oregon is kind of the only team right now that has truly looked dominant, and they're really the only undefeated team. I mean, BYU's up there as well, but obviously haven't really played anyone. And I think at least between the Big Ten and SEC, Oregon's the only undefeated team, but they kind of struggled a little bit at the beginning of the season. They only beat Boise State by 3 points. Obviously that's a pretty good Boise State team, but you would expect the number 1 team in the country to be better than that. Ohio State with a loss to Oregon, Penn State with a loss to Ohio State. So they're all kind of stacked up behind each other there. And then obviously you look at the SEC, all of them have at least 1 loss. Texas right now is the highest representative, but even and I just tweeted about this like a couple hours ago, and it was less about me trying to make a specific point or push a specific narrative. It was just kind of out of interest. I decided to look into it, and if you compare Texas and Penn State's resume right now, I think they're very similar. They're both sitting at 8-1, 1 spot apart in both the AP and college football poll. Neither team actually has a ranked win if you're going off current rankings. Texas obviously beat Michigan in the non-conference, which Michigan at the time was number 10. We all know, that was a pretty fraudulent ranking in hindsight, because the Wolverines are sitting at 5-5 right now. Texas also beat Oklahoma, which at the time was a ranked Oklahoma team. Oklahoma is now 5-5, potentially going to miss out on a bowl game with a couple of tough games remaining. And then Texas also has a 3-point win over Vanderbilt, which at the time Vanderbilt was number 24, but is now out of the rankings. And so when you're comparing the team's resumes, I actually think Texas and Penn State have a similar resume. So if you're going to hold the lack of a ranked win against Penn State, I think you have to say the exact same thing about Texas, which is sitting at number 3 and has a loss to number 12 Georgia by 15 points and just did not look competitive in that game.
Yeah, I think Pat Forde and some of these other pundits are guilty of grading Penn State on a curve. And I think it's a matter of, because they don't win these games against Ohio State, well, then they're not a serious contender, in college football at large, because, Alabama's beaten Georgia, and that was a huge matchup what had happened before both of those teams had 2 losses. What a huge matchup Texas-Michigan was. Texas-Oklahoma, I believe, was ranked versus ranked at the time. And those programs all get the benefit of the build-up to those games, and then we just kind of forget about what happens after them. And because Penn State doesn't have as many opportunities, and because the opportunities that they have gone sour, it's like, Penn State should just start at, like, I think in some of these people's minds, like, they can't go any higher than 11 because they haven't beaten Ohio State and therefore they don't deserve it. It's I don't think it takes the full national conversation into consideration. Do I think there are teams that are more talented than Penn State out there? Probably, but they haven't proven it. And I think there's more parity in the sport. I think that's what you're seeing, and I think that's going to be a byproduct somewhat of conference realignment. When you're consolidating all of these power programs into 2 conferences, they're inevitably going to beat each other up. And I think that's to some extent what we've seen in both the SEC and the Big Ten. I think the problem the SEC is having is that it's not the programs that everyone expects to be, leading that pack. It's not Alabama. It's not Georgia. You have Texas. You have Tennessee. So in people's minds, they say, well, it doesn't matter how many games Alabama and Georgia lose. We still think those teams are good. And then Texas and Tennessee are also good. And so they should all be in the top 5, even if the results don't bear that out. It's just, why play the games then? Is kind of where I come down on this. And, I'm willing to listen to people who say that Penn State's not one of the 4 most talented teams in the country, but someone's got to prove it, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's just so many different, criteria that you could use, depending on what you want to look at, whether you want to look at, what's your best win, what's your worst loss, what's, your strength of schedule, all these different things. And like you said, there's a bit more kind of consolidation at the top. There's a little bit more parity now, because of a few changes. Conference realignment is part of that. And one of the other things that comes with conference realignment is with so many teams in the conference, there's a lot of teams that aren't going to play each other near the top of the standings. The Big Ten, you have, Oregon, Penn State, and Indiana, none of which play each other. They've all played Ohio State, which, Ohio State kind of draws the short end of the stick there, which is probably one of the rare times in recent Big Ten history where they've actually had, one of the tougher schedules, probably the toughest schedule in the conference this year. But the SEC is a little bit different where, all the top teams are playing each other, which they all have wins over each other. It seems like it seems like you could go in a circle between all those top SEC teams, and you can count that as a great win over a top 10 team, and of course people are going to try and also paint that as a great quality loss to another top 10 SEC team, and they're just all kind of being up on each other. But I think the thing is the SEC is kind of going in. It's I would say it's in a bit of a down period right now, which even in a down period, the SEC is probably still the best conference in the country, which is a little bit crazy to say, but obviously with Nick Saban retiring, Alabama's kind of in that transition phase. Obviously, they've taken a couple bad losses with Kalen DeBoer. Georgia, I think, is struggling a little bit, especially to get some good quarterback play from Carson Beck. And then some of the other top teams obviously have taken losses as well. Typically, you would have one or two undefeated SEC teams at this point in the season, but you don't this year. And in a 4-team playoff, the SEC might only get one or even no bids this year. But you look at it, and there are still a ton of talented teams in the SEC. So, when you're going down the list, there's 6 or 7 teams that I think are capable of beating Penn State, whether it's Georgia, Texas, Alabama, Ole Miss, Tennessee, LSU even, who have the talent and have the, ceiling of beating Penn State, but they also have proven to be inconsistent, and they have the floor of losing to, Kentucky, Arkansas, Vanderbilt, whatever it may be. And so I think there's a lot of very volatile teams in the SEC, and I think the playoffs could kind of go one of two ways, where you get all these SEC teams who are, extremely talented and have all these 4 or 5-star recruits, blue chip recruits, and they go in and they're motivated and they kind of, are locked in for these playoff games and they play well. And then everyone's going to be, talking about how the SEC should have gotten more bids, or maybe they play a bad game and then all of a sudden the narrative flips and it's, they had too many SEC teams in it and whatever and things like that. But we've already seen, ESPN specifically talking about how, SEC teams with 3 losses shouldn't be eliminated quite yet. They can, they still have a chance to make the playoffs and things like that. We've already heard from, some of the major reporters and some of the major outlets that, these teams should still get a shot should they sustain, a third loss throughout the season. There's a ton of SEC teams in that boat where they have either 1 or 2 losses and potentially 1 or 2 tough games remaining that they could drop. So we're kind of already setting the stage to get extra SEC teams in.
Yeah, I see. Here's my thing. I don't even think the SEC is down. I think you just have a lot of lazy dummies who want to mentally pencil Georgia and Alabama into their top 5s no matter what happens on the field, and they can't live with the idea that maybe Tennessee and Texas are better. And they're the standard bearers of the SEC. I think there are people. I think there's probably longtime SEC people who don't like that about Texas. They still view Texas as a Big 12 team, and therefore, someone else should be, more elevated because, of that reason. I think so much of it is just lazy thinking, and I hope we see an SEC title game of Tennessee and Texas, because I think that would maybe shift the paradigm about how you talk about a Penn State, and things change, and I think that's the point of this playoff, is to end the kind of saturation at the top. So, do I have a huge problem with a 3-loss team getting in? Not really, but just the way people talk about it is annoying sometimes. You mentioned there in your one answer, Joel, about how you think there are 6, 7, 8 teams that could beat Penn State. How many would you seriously say are more talented than Penn State today? And I'm not just talking about the SEC. I'd say any team in these rankings that is behind Penn State. Do we think Indiana? I mean, this is a big debate because they are undefeated, to their credit, but I think they're in a similar situation of they don't have a ton of impressive wins. do you think the people that want to rank Indiana ahead of Penn State right now are somewhat just doing some underdog wish fulfillment?
I think that could be the case. I think a lot of it is maybe you could argue some inconsistency from the committee, just in terms of, if you're going to prop Penn State up for having only one loss ahead of some, maybe 2-loss SEC schools, then shouldn't you be propping up the no-loss team from the same conference? And I think there is some validity to that. There's some merit to that argument, but at the same time, and I think a lot of the rankings is determined by brand bias, and you could argue, rightfully or not, but I think there is some merit to saying, this team historically hasn't been great, and there's something to that where, they just don't have kind of that winning culture in place. They haven't put together strong recruiting classes. They haven't been able to do it in the past, and I think there is something to that. I think you should kind of take that into consideration when weighing it out, because obviously Indiana's been impressive and they've been blowing out these teams, but even last Saturday against Michigan, they struggled to put away a Michigan team that's 5-5, and that might be the best team that Indiana's faced all year, and they kind of struggled with that. I still think Indiana, even if they lose to Ohio State, dependent on the score, but I think Indiana should probably still make the playoffs at 11-1, unless they get absolutely blown out or something like that by Ohio State. But I mean, and again, they those two still have that game coming up, and that'll kind of make things more clear. There's no need, I think, to really split hairs between Penn State and Indiana, because once they play Ohio State, then, we'll have a great kind of comparison between the two. How did they, compare against that common opponent, and did Indiana look like it was on the same kind of tier in competitiveness against that team?
I think the only team that's really on my radar that I think has a legit beef in terms of being behind Penn State is probably Tennessee. They have the nice win against Bama. They've beaten some decent SEC teams along the way. They got that win against Oklahoma when they were ranked as well. And then you have the common opponent with Kent State, where they steamrolled them in a way that Penn State really didn't until kind of the second half. I don't know. You're splitting hairs at that point, but I think they're the only team on that list that I look out and say that seems like a legitimate beef to me. Everyone else, either has a very stupid loss like Alabama to Vanderbilt, or they've just not played as well as consistently, to your point, Joel. And so I think really Tennessee's the only one that has a possible legit beef. Let's move on and talk a little bit about people's angst with Peacock and NBC and the television deals in the Big Ten generally. Usually, and we're going to get to the Big Ten noon conversation in a second, because that has started to expand outside of Happy Valley as a point of frustration for a lot of people. But the whiteout game ends up on NBC. I was at home. I know you were at the stadium, so you probably didn't get to see what I saw. But there was no pregame show whatsoever. I turned it on at I think I turned the Peacock thing on and said, waiting for your event to begin until like after 8 o'clock. I think it was 8:02, 8:03 before they even, joined the broadcast. And then they kicked the ball off almost immediately. It seemed like they had not sold advertising for the full commercial breaks, because there was, a good 30, 45 seconds at the end of several breaks where it was just waiting for, the event to continue. It was just like a waiting screen. There was no ads. And there's people out there boycotting. Kevin Horn, someone I went to school with, who hosts another Penn State podcast. He said, cancel your Peacock subscription. Some people are trying to boycott. How did you feel about how the whiteout was handled for Penn State this week?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you're a big brand like Penn State, you're expecting to never be playing on, Peacock instead of, a national channel, or at least at the very worst Big Ten network, something like that. I think part of it, and it was interesting because James Franklin after the game was talking about it a little bit, and them being able to get, the whiteout at night and everything like that. And he was talking about how Pat Kraft had to kind of pull some strings to be able to work with the networks to be able to get the game at night. And I think it almost sounded to me, and it was kind of a vague statement, so I can't really confirm this, but it almost sounded to me like Penn State chose to play the game on, a lesser network in order to get it in that night time slot. I think they probably had the opportunity to play, let's say at noon on, whatever Big Ten network or some other bigger station, but I think they chose value the night game over the network, and that's how they ended up on Peacock. And I think that was, partially Penn State's decision to do that from the university standpoint, but obviously for the fans, especially the ones who weren't able to make it in person, they kind of got the short end of the stick with that, having to watch the Peacock broadcast, which again, I wasn't watching necessarily, but I obviously saw kind of the backlash on Twitter, what everyone was saying, and even from a national audience, like I know like Josh Pate, who covers the sport at a national level, was tweeting about how bad the presentation was for that game, and yeah, he's not like a Penn State guy, but even he noticed that, and then was felt the need to kind of post about it. So obviously it must have been pretty bad. I think I heard like Colt McCoy was calling some of the Washington receivers by like Penn State names, like one of the Washington receivers got called Trey Harris at some point or something like that. So obviously it ended up being pretty bad, and it's probably a pretty poor reflection on Penn State. But I do think, to be fair to the networks, I think Penn State played a role in that decision to have it broadcast on Peacock because they wanted it to be in that night time slot, and I think that was really the only option they had.
Well, but that's the network's fault. That's Penn State's only option. I think that's the axe that a lot of people have to grind, is the way they've done this television deal. The options to get Penn State in primetime are pretty much only NBC, and NBC juggles Notre Dame. That was the problem. They had Notre Dame and Florida State in primetime. That was probably decided well before the season, thinking that would be a hyper nationally relevant game, and then it ends up not. But those things, as easy as it might seem for you or I, that you can just flip a switch and put Penn State on NBC and put those two on Peacock. Notre Dame has exclusivity in their contract, and that is probably the issue that Penn State was running up against. And I think that transitions well into the big noon conversation, in that it seems like Ohio State fans are finally getting fed up, because I believe they are now ending the season with something like 6 noon kickoffs in a row. I think they had a few early in the season. It's like Ohio State is practically not playing after about 3 p.m. most weeks. Do you think something's going to give in this television contract situation, where it seems like Penn State, Michigan, Ohio State specifically are having Big Noon Saturday foisted on them 2, 3, 4 times a year because they are the biggest brands in the conference. They deliver the biggest audiences, when they play, that Fox is always going to choose them for those time slots, regardless of whether the game is any good or not. I mean, I believe it was Ohio State-Purdue on Big Noon this week. I believe the show went to Texas Tech, Colorado, because that was a bigger game. But the actual Big Noon Saturday labeled game was Ohio State-Purdue. And you have Joel Klatt out here. He was on Twitter saying, "Oh, we love to showcase, the best environments in college football." I'm like, is Ohio State-Purdue really the greatest environment in college football? Is that something we need to showcase? Are people at the shoe so fired up for that game that's something that is can't miss television? The answer is obviously no. And it's just so disingenuous to me, Joel, that they pretend it's anything other than we're parking the biggest brands where they face the least competition from, ESPN's SEC package, and that it's any more complicated than that.
Yeah, no, I think you're completely right. And I think tensions are higher now than they've ever been. You mentioned, the situation with Ohio State. I've seen a lot more, stuff on social media from Ohio State fans complaining about it. And I think there was one tweet that went viral where it was just a picture of the stadium at night with the red LED lights kind of illuminating the whole stadium in red. And it was saying, by the way, Fox, like our stadium can do this. We just haven't been able to show you because you keep giving us these noon games. But I think, yeah, to your point, especially the bigger brands, Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, are getting fed up by this. And even at Penn State, if you go downtown in the student bookstore, they're selling white T-shirts that say, I hate Big Noon or Big Noon sucks or whatever it is. And I know people who have bought those shirts. I know people who have worn those shirts. I saw them in the stands at the game on Saturday against Washington. And obviously, I think the tensions are higher now than they've ever been. You mentioned Joel Klatt kind of going out and making a tweet about it and kind of backing up, Fox trying to kind of explain from their point of view why they're doing things. And I do agree that it felt disingenuous to say that they were trying to, showcase the best environments in college football. And I even saw, I think it was like a Fox executive who was tweeting and replying to someone. And then his tweet kind of went viral, but he was essentially saying that, this window has averaged the highest viewership of any, TV window or, of any network over the last, whatever, 3-4 years. And that's what happens when you keep picking Ohio State and Penn State and Michigan games, who have, some of the biggest fan bases in college football. Like it's not because people want to watch a noon game on Fox. It's because people want to watch those three teams. And if they have to do it at noon on Fox, they'll do it, but they're not going to be happy about it.
Yeah, it's and I think my big thing too is if you sent Big Noon around, right, and it was going to more Big Ten schools that are playing significant games for like bowl eligibility, right? That's this time of year you're talking about which teams are going to get into the postseason. You've got these kind of lesser Big Ten rival. I don't want to call them lesser. They're just other rivalry games. Can't we get like Iowa, Minnesota as the Big Noon game? Is that asking too much? Are not enough people going to watch that in the noon window to make it worthwhile? What they're doing with Big Noon is just dressing it up as College Game Day, but not doing any of the stuff that has made College Game Day, what it is. And part of that is they will go anywhere to an interesting destination, to an interesting backdrop, and they will make that game matter, even if it doesn't. Even if you and I aren't waking up, I think when they went to Montana State a few years ago, it's called Brawl of the Wild, something like that. They highlight that. Now all of a sudden you want to watch that game because College Game Day went there. And that's what I think Fox is posing as if they're doing, but they're not. They're just picking the big brands. And I think it's going to start to hurt, especially like a Penn State where you have to drive well outside a metropolitan area to get to the game if you don't live in central Pennsylvania. A lot of people like to go up to State College and spend the day, and they're not going to do that if the game's over by 3:30, and especially if Penn State loses to Ohio State, because that just lets the air out of the balloon of going up there on a fall Saturday. So, I'll be interested to see what the long-term implications are for the program, of having to keep doing that over and over. Joel, let's talk a little bit of football before we wrap up here. Kind of do some quick hits. How much stock are you putting in the receivers bouncing back a little bit against Washington? Trey Wallace here in the box score, 5 catches, 84 yards. Liam Clifford had a catch for 20 yards. Julian Fleming, 2 for 19. I think that's still less than you'd like to see outside of Trey Wallace, but at least they played better than they did against Ohio State.
Yeah, I thought it actually was a pretty impressive showing. And obviously, Washington isn't a great team, and they're not on the level of, say, an Ohio State. But statistically, they've been one of the best secondaries in college football. I know entering the game, the stat that was thrown around was that Washington was number 2 in the country in passing yards allowed per game. I'm not sure what it is now. They've probably dropped maybe a little bit after last Saturday's game. But regardless, that's a secondary that's been playing really well. A secondary that, statistically is better than Ohio State, not necessarily talent-wise, but they've allowed, fewer passing yards than Ohio State. And so for Penn State to, not put together a great game, it wasn't, another 300-yard performance from Aller, but it was a solid game. He was, I think, 20 for 28, so very efficient. And like you mentioned, the receivers were getting involved more than – it wasn't just the Tyler Warren show, although, he certainly had his moments. It was Harrison Wallace looked good, looked consistent. Aller went to him a few times in bigger moments. Liam Clifford, obviously the 20-yard catch was big, and a few more guys were able to get involved there. And I think it's a good little step forward for Penn State. Julian Fleming as well with his first touchdown as a Nittany Lion was kind of a big moment. And potentially they can use that as kind of a stepping stone moving forward. But again, I don't want to put too much stock into one game just based on kind of the broader outlook of the entire season and how things have played out, especially in bigger moments. I still think it's going to be, especially if you're talking about, looking down the line when Penn State's in a playoff situation, I think they're still going to be wanting to go to Tyler Warren and potentially the running backs, maybe get Nick Singleton involved. I don't know how much they really will trust their wide receivers in that type of situation. So yeah, I wouldn't put too much stock into it, but I think they did exceed my expectations as a unit.
Yeah, I think people are going to have to see them do it against a playoff team, and that's just what happens when you have 3 catches total against Ohio State, as the Penn State receivers did. Joel, you mentioned Nick Singleton. What's the latest understanding you have about him, and if he's forced to miss any time between now and the end of the regular season, does that change your outlook for this team, one iota?
Yeah, so I think moving forward, he should be, good to go. Franklin talked about kind of what happened with him, called it a short-term injury, and also said that he had been dealing with kind of some on and off injuries throughout the season, which I think sheds a little bit light, and that was kind of the assumption going in, but obviously we couldn't confirm it. We hadn't actually heard from Nick or from Franklin or anyone, on the record about his kind of injury status. We still don't know what the injury was, but we do know he missed the UCLA game, and then when he came back against USC and Wisconsin and a couple of those games, he didn't look like himself. Looked a little bit slower. Obviously, yards per carry were way down. And so I think, during those games, he definitely wasn't at 100%. He still made a decent impact in the passing game. Brought in a good amount of passes, and then, again, against Washington, leaves the game there. I think if you're Penn State, you'll be fine. Again, Franklin called it a short-term injury, which typically, he could be back on Saturday, or maybe it'll be 1 to 2 weeks. Regardless, I think he'll be back for any potential postseason scenario for Penn State. So, and I think Penn State should be completely fine for these last 3 games if Singleton does have to miss any time. I think it was a good opportunity to kind of see what the Nittany Lions had behind him. Corey Smith got in the game, which I thought was interesting personally, because up until this point we had kind of presumed that Quentin Martin would be kind of that third man up, and he had been getting most of the reps as kind of RB3, but it was Corey Smith who got into the game against Washington, and obviously had that, I think, 74-yard run on his second carry of the night, which was obviously really impressive to see. He got kind of hawked down there at the end, couldn't quite make it into the end zone, but regardless, still an impressive run, and he had a solid showing. He was only in the game for, I think, 5 or 6 snaps, and he got carries on all of them. They just kind of put him in to ice the game, and the fact that, they were up, 35-6, or I think 28-6 the first time they put him in, but regardless, the game had already been put away and everything like that, but he did what he was asked to do. They wanted him to come in and ice the game, and he had a big run to get a first down, and then kept moving the ball a few yards on the other carries as well. So I thought he was kind of impressive, and he showed that, if Singleton isn't able to go, and if you don't want to put too much strain on Kaytron Allen, and you don't want to, put too much of a workload on him heading into the postseason, you kind of want to ease back. I think you've proven now that you have enough depth, whether it's Quentin Martin, whether it's Corey Smith, you have the running backs, that there's not a significant drop off at the position if you need to rest Nick and Kaytron heading into the postseason.
2 sacks for Abdul Carter. He's had 2 sacks in each of the last 2 games. He's up to 8 for the season. I believe you and I talked about 10 as the over-under in the preseason. How far above that do you think he can go? And do you think he can be a dominant force, kind of like Micah Parsons was in the Cotton Bowl, once Penn State gets to the playoffs? Do you think he's got the command of this switch to defensive end that he can be a truly disruptive force that maybe we hadn't seen for much of the season while he was working through that transition, but that now he's beginning to master things?
Yeah. I think sacks are a little bit harder to predict, just because, you can get pressure, you can get into the backfield, you can touch the quarterback or whatever it may be without necessarily getting the sack. But I think, if you want to put a number on it, maybe 11 to 12 feels realistic for the rest of the season, just kind of the pace that he's been on, what he's been able to do. I've also noticed that, he's essentially getting held on every play. And I think if you're a ref, you don't want to throw a flag on every play of the game, because obviously you're just kind of slowing the game down and things like that. And especially when it's, something at the line of scrimmage between offensive and defensive linemen, those guys can kind of get away with a lot. I do feel like that's kind of unfortunate that it hasn't necessarily been called as much as, I think it should be this season. I think he could be even more productive if refs were a little bit more, kind of locked in on calling, holding when it's there and when it's blatant and things like that. But I guess that's just like my little rant about that. Regardless, he's still been, successful this season. You mentioned already up to 8 sacks, and I think he was Big Ten Defensive Player of the Week. I think he won some other Player of the Week award. He's also been named, a semifinalist for all these big national awards and stuff like that. So he's clearly still getting the recognition that he deserves after these performances. But to your point about, potentially a game-wrecking postseason performance, I think it's certainly possible. I think a lot of it does depend on, who Penn State gets matched up against. Based on the most recent round of the CFP rankings, Penn State would be hosting Ole Miss, which I think Ole Miss has actually done a lot to improve their offensive line. I think they brought in a few portal guys and things like that. So I think it would be a difficult task for him for sure. But, obviously I think no matter who he's playing, he's good enough that he should be able to make an impact. I don't know if he can have, necessarily a Micah Parsons type performance. And I think, that kind of is dependent on who the opponent is and what their offensive line is really looking like. But I think he can definitely make an impact regardless.
Get you out of here on this, Joel. Penn State basketball is 3-0. I think you would maybe say that's not a huge deal this early in the season because of the caliber of competition, but they've been scoring a ton of points. 108 in the first game against Binghamton, 103 against UMBC, and then last night against St. Francis. After what was a dogfight for a good chunk of that game, Penn State pulls away, wins 92-62, and covers. I think that they were 28.5-point favorites. Is it notable to you how efficient this offense is playing against this caliber of competition, and how far do you think we're gonna? How much do you think we're gonna find out on Friday when they face Virginia Tech at home on exclusively on Peacock?
Yeah, I guess Penn State fans don't want to cancel their subscription just yet. You probably want to get that game in, but to your point, the offense has been, extremely efficient. Obviously, the first time in program history they had back-to-back 100-point games, and so obviously you're looking at that as a historically good Penn State offense. And obviously, the competition hasn't necessarily been great so far, and so it's always kind of difficult to read into how good these teams are this early in the season when they're going through the non-conference. But I think it's been really impressive, and I think what that says is. And Penn State, I do want to say, is a team that was picked to finish 17th in the Big Ten. I believe it was the coaches poll that picked them to finish 17th out of 18. They're not going to finish 17th. They might not be a top 5 team in the Big Ten, but they'll be competitive. And I think the fact that they have an offense that has shown to be as good as it's been so far, I think that gives them the potential to beat a lot of teams. They're certainly going to lose some games. And the Big Ten is obviously a tough conference. I'm not expecting Penn State to be, among the Big Ten's best this year. But at the same time, I think Penn State will be capable of beating every team on its schedule just because, of that offensive explosiveness that it possesses. I think that allows Penn State kind of the ceiling of, being able to beat anyone in the country. Just, if they have a hot shooting night, they can kind of take down anyone. And obviously, if they can get hot for a stretch of games and potentially at the right time, then maybe they can make some noise heading into the postseason. But to your point, I think the Virginia Tech game will be a pretty good test. Some are calling it the Joel Haas Bowl, as the Hokies were the team I grew up rooting for. But it seems like those two for some reason play every year. It seems like they always play in the non-conference, which is interesting, whether it's the Big Ten, ACC, Challenger, or whatever it is. But I think that will be a good test. I think the Hokies are a little bit worse than people were expecting heading into the season. I saw that they had their lowest attendance in like 15 years at one of their non-conference games. So obviously the fans aren't necessarily bought in, and I think they've underperformed the last couple of years. But regardless, it's a power conference school that expects to at least be in contention for the tournament every year. And so if you're Penn State, obviously that's a big test to see kind of how the offense looks against a pretty legitimate defense. And yeah, it'll be an interesting game. I'll definitely be tuned into that one with some bragging rights on the line within my household. But yeah, I think it'll be a good test for Penn State.
Yeah, I think I saw that 17th ranking preseason as well, Joel, and I just I think we've seen a lot worse Penn State teams than this one. I think the problem when people, and that's what happens this time of year. There's 300 Division I schools. Anyone who believes that outside of like a handful of guys that anyone's really studying a whole bunch of these teams in a lot of depth, especially in the transfer portal era, is probably a little crazy. But I think the problem Penn State had perception-wise is you had Ace Baldwin, and then a lot of these returning guys just didn't average more than 6, 7, 8 points a game. So it was really easy to go down the box score or the stats from last season and say, well, there's no obvious number 2 scorer on this team. There's no obvious, guy who you can count on to make shots consistently. And as long as that's the case, it's hard to pick them to do much of anything. So I think it's going to be interesting to see, can one of these guys step up with some level of consistency in the non-conference and identify themselves as that second, third option that the teams are really going to have to game plan for. And B, if no one does, how well can Penn State leverage the depth of guys they have coming back and that who are, did make a few shots individually last season. How much can the depth of their bench leverage against some of these teams that may have better guys at the top. But Joel, that's all we got for this week. I look forward to chatting a little bit further. Next week after Purdue, setting up the game against Minnesota, which I think really is the last real big one left on Penn State's schedule. That could, that's the one I'm looking at as the one that could sidetrack them from college football playoff contention. Excited for that conversation, but until then, everyone make sure you subscribe to the channel. We will talk to you again next week.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all of the sports coverage the Post-Gazette has to offer, visit post-gazette.com.